I'm Dan McDade, your host and president of PointClear. My guest today is Paul Gillin. Paul, Happy New Year and welcome to PowerViews Live.
Happy New Year to you too, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you. We'll come back to a more formal introduction in just a moment, but first just a few housekeeping items. If I push the right button here, we seem to have a couple of technical difficulties, but just a couple of housekeeping items for the audience. First, you can use the Q&A button in the box to your right for any questions. We'll actually try to handle those questions as they come up to the extent we can. The recorded presentation will be available in probably less than 48 hours, and you will receive an email when that is available to you. You might want to stick around for the after party. We typically go from 1 to 1:30 with the formal part of today's session, but we'll stick around for any questions that might come up. The PowerPoint is also available. If you go to the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you can download today's presentation. And if you feel that we say something that's of value that you want to tweet out, you can use #PowerViews Live as the hashtag. And I continue to push the wrong button here. Let me get back here. Now, Paul, why don't you, the audience can read your bio here, but why don't you tell them a little bit about yourself and maybe what you'd most like for them to take away from today's session?
Well, thank you, Dan. Yeah, my background is rather unusual for someone who's a self-described marketing consultant. I actually never worked in marketing. I was in media for more than 25 years, predominantly technology media, Computer World, if you remember that publication. I was there for 15 years, was editor-in-chief there for the last 4 years of that. Worked at an internet startup in the technology publishing area after that, and then went out on my own, 9 years ago, and really intending to do something very different from what I ended up doing. I discovered social media almost as soon as I went out on my own, and I've always been a publishing geek. I love publishing. And social media struck me as something that was just going to change, have broad sweeping changes throughout the way we sell and the way we interact with each other. So I turned all of my attention to helping to understand and document that phenomenon. So in the process, I've written 5 books about online communities. I have written extensively for B2B Magazine. I was a columnist there for 7 years. I've written for Mashable and Media Profs, a number of other outlets, and as well as maintained 2 blogs. So I write a lot, and I pay a lot of attention to what's going on in these channels and how it changes the way we interact with our constituents. So what we're going to talk about today is something that has really been kind of a campaign of mine recently to take some of the principles of publishing and apply them to sales and marketing because they work very well in that context too.
Okay, well, thank you. And just briefly about PointClear, we provide our clients with lead generation and nurturing programs. Last year, we generated about $100 million in revenue for our clients. We typically work with technology companies and manufacturers, distributors. We have a gas company that we sell natural gas contracts to B2B clients. So we do a little bit of everything. Paul, when we were first talking about getting together for this presentation, you said something that really stuck with me, and I've actually got it right here. Hopefully I'm not going to steal your thunder, but you mentioned about talking to marketing colleagues at IBM and asking them about who their buyers were, and you talked about that was, you got back title, budget, company size, buying responsibility, and the usual demographic stuff. And you said, no, tell me about the buyers. And you came to learn that in many cases, the marketing people had actually never met or talked to a buyer. And you wanted to really focus more on the psychographic issues, which is really why we're here today. So let me give it to you to take it away from here, and I'll add some comments as we go along.
Sure. Thank you, Dan. Well, and I don't want to point the finger at IBM, incidentally. I mean, I think I've seen this across many businesses that I've worked with, that marketers
Sure.
really are kept away from the customer. And in fact, the sales force in many cases actively prevents them from getting in contact with the customer. So I don't think it's, I think this is sort of endemic to the sales and marketing process, where marketers are
Sure.
trained to talk. They're not really trained to understand. And of course, uh, content marketing and the peer-to-peer nature of customer conversations right now has changed the dynamics of that equation, where customers do much of their research now before they actually enter the so-called traditional buying funnel. And so we have to be able to intercept, understand where they are in that funnel and how to engage them at different stages, because we can't just assume that they're coming in at the early stages of the funnel. Now you're looking at a slide right now that I apologize, it's rather hard to figure out, but it's from a study that I would encourage. It was one of the most important studies I've read in the last 2 years. It was done by the CEB Marketing Leadership Council and Google in October 2013, and they asked a bunch of B2B buyers about the influence of personal factors on their decisions, and what they found was an extraordinarily high correlation between the personal value of the companies they did business with and the perceived personal value of a decision and their willingness to actually spend money and to make that decision. And in fact, in B2B markets, this was nearly twice as high as it was in B2C markets. And I was struck by these numbers because it really reinforced to me the personal nature, how important personal factors are in decisions of all kind, but particularly in decisions where there may be millions of dollars at stake and even the future of the company may be at stake. So when you think of a B2B decision, I think we tend to think of them in rather dry, sterile terms, as it's made based upon numbers and hard calculations and spreadsheets. In fact, a lot of these decisions are intensely personal because the people who are making them, their careers are on the line, the success of the company is on the line, their personal prestige, their status with their peers, their career development is on the line. And so these are intensely personal decisions. Marketers typically are not trained in how to appeal to those people. Interestingly, as I mentioned my publishing background at first, this is the heart and soul of what publishers do. They understand the first thing you learn when you get into publishing is who is that audience? How do you personify the audience? How do you understand them really at a very gut level, and deliver content that will interest them because it is intrinsically it has value to them personally. Now, another piece of research that came out about the same time, again, a little difficult to unravel, but you can look up the source. It's clickable here. McKinsey study came out the same month, looked at 700 B2B buyers and senior level B2B buyers, and the issues that they identified as being most important to their decision-making processes. McKinsey then looked at the 50 largest B2B companies, analyzed their marketing messages, and categorized them, and then compared them to the factors that the customers identified as important. And what you saw was a nearly total disconnect between what customers said was important, which are the gray bars, and what marketers were talking about, which are the yellow bars. And in fact, even more so, you found that the marketers were most of these companies were talking about the same thing. They were stressing the same points, and those points were not the factors that their customers had identified as being important. So we have a disconnect here, and we have a gap that I think we need to bridge, and psychographics is part of that process.
Yeah, I think also, just to jump in here for a second, the Ardith Albee has a new book that came out yesterday called Digital Relevance, and one of the things she talks about shrinking attention spans, blocking out increasing noise, and being overwhelmed by the velocity of content publishing. And I guess one of the reasons that people feel that way is because they're actually not being talked to with the information that they're looking for. They're being talked to with what companies feel is important. So I think this slide does a great job of clarifying that.
Yes, well, of course, marketers, as a rule, are taught to talk, not to listen. And we're in a world now where it's very easy for people to shut out their messages and to talk only to each other. So it changes the rules of engagement. You have to engage with your customers now on a level where they are defining the rules, they're defining the topic, and you have to be tuned into them. So this the experience that you cited earlier, where talking to some of my colleagues in marketing, asking them to describe the customers and finding out that they thought of the customers in terms of hard dollar titles, company size terms, really got me focused on how can I bring some of the lessons of the publisher business to marketing. And when you look at, what are psychographics, how does it compare to demographics? Well, demographics is things like buying power, is size of the company, is number of employees, your budget, your identified need, your title. These things we routinely use to decide whether a prospect is a good one. In psychographics, you're looking at things like motivations, fears, passions, goals, self-image, needs, and dislikes. Now, these are very personal. They're also more difficult to get at because they're not reported to the SEC. They're not on a financial statement somewhere. These go down to the characteristics of the individuals you're dealing with in the course of creating a sales discussion.
I know that years ago, probably now it's been 20 plus years ago, I was responsible for creating training material for sales executives and sales managers. And it's interesting how closely this aligns with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which starts out basically with psychological or physiological things such as safety, and then psychological things such as belongingness, love, esteem, self-fulfillment, and then finally self-actualization. In a sense, it's amazing how quickly things change, and it's amazing how quickly they stay the same.
I love your analogy of Maslow because when you think of how marketing is traditionally done, it is at the higher end of the Maslow hierarchy. It's very much on an intellectual basis, but where the decisions really get made, where you really impact people is when you can hit them on hit them at the lowest levels of the hierarchy. The need to survive, the need for warmth and shelter and contact with others and love and all of these things that are essential to us as human beings. We tend to put those things aside when we market because we think that people are making intellectual decisions. I would argue that our core decisions, we may make them intellectually, but ultimately, if we're not comfortable with them at a visceral level, then we're not going to be comfortable with that decision. So let's
It's
move ahead.
interesting also in that same article or same report that you were talking about, they talked about the rider and the elephant, with the rider representing rational decision making and the elephant representing emotional decision making. And so the example that they didn't use there is if the elephant hears a scary noise behind them, they're going to throw the rational rider out of the equation and basically react on emotion and go ahead and run out of the way. So I think that's an interesting way of showing what could happen to a buyer who rationally might make a decision to buy something, but emotionally, can't pull the trigger because of fear of risk, that they might lose their job, they might not be viewed the same way that they were previously. So again, I agree with you. That was just a terrific report.
In the technology industry, there's a term called FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, that's often used. And FUD is how big companies sell. So, your Oracles, IBMs, HPs, Microsofts typically sell on FUD because they're the safe choice, and customers buy from them because they are willing to pay more money to get the safe choice, so that it doesn't represent a risk to them personally, to their business and to their career. It works very well for big companies. If you're selling if you're a startup, you're selling more to people's sense of risk, of getting ahead, of taking chances, and a very different kind of sale. And you don't want to sell using the same terms. I want to move along here because I know we have limited time. Visualize your reader is important. I used to have a boss, Pat McGovern, the founder of IDG, used to say you should have a picture of your reader, on your wall, so you can look at that person every time you're talking to that person. You know what they look like. You can visualize them in your mind. Not a bad idea. Questions. So how do you think psychographically? Well, these are some of the questions I recommend you ask about the customer you're trying to reach. Imagine yourself in a similar decision-making scenario. Put yourself in the shoes of your customer. What issues occur to you? And I'm not talking about the issues of how the products compare on the spreadsheet. I'm talking about what is going to happen to you if you make the right or the wrong decision. How might your solution serve your audience's need for things like success, recognition, professional fulfillment, promotion, the peer endorsement? Get beyond just how it might work on an ROI basis. What fears does your solution address? Fear of failure, fear of being compromised, fear of letting down others. These are those lower levels on the Maslow hierarchy. How can you help your customer get a promotion or bonus? How will your product do that? How can you make your buyer a hero? Two of our strongest motivations for decisions are fear and opportunity. And fear, by the way, is a much more powerful motivator than opportunity. Now, much of our marketing is based upon opportunity selling. We sell We sell what you can accomplish if you make this choice. But in fact, fear is a more powerful motivator. So can you appeal to that fear instinct? It's, in most cases, big business buy cases, there is some element of fear involved because people are afraid of doing the wrong thing. So how can you address that fear even if it's not spoken? Imagine your customer giving a testimonial. What might he or she say? Often you'll find that what they'll talk about is about intangible factors, how well you supported the customer, how easy you were to work with, what a great partner you are. These are not speeds and feeds, but they're factors I think ultimately are more important to the decision.
When I was going back again to the days when I was doing training, it's interesting when I read through this, it tied, really well, and that is we used to talk about why companies buy on behalf of companies and why companies buy on behalf of themselves. And the four reasons we suggested that people buy for themselves is compensation, recognition, security, and self-actualization, going back to Maslow. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, you find very few people who buy because it's the right thing to do, not only because it's the right thing to do, because it may actually be also too risky to do. But it's interesting how it keeps coming back to compensation, recognition, security, and self-actualization.
The term self-actualization is a very appropriate one. So let's look at how you might profile these people. And this is an exercise I do when I work with marketers and teach writing, because I enjoy teaching writing, and that really this is all part of the exercise of understanding the audience. So you take a person that you're trying to reach and profile them based upon these kinds of factors. So their position, but what are their motivations? This is an example I created for small business IT managers, a group I know fairly well. And so was able to plug in some descriptors that fit these categories. Motivations, getting it right, pleasing users, pleasing the boss, recognition, peer approval, raises, and promotions. They're not thinking big for the most part. They're thinking about small wins. Demotivations be inefficiency, bureaucracy, politics, laziness. They like technology, puzzles, games, the kind of geeky. Um, they don't like pretentious people, yes men, people who don't try. Fears, they worry about getting it wrong, about letting people down, losing their job, not knowing what to do. There's a lot of fear about how they would sustain their families, how they would find another job. Um, they define accomplishment, figuring out the solution before anybody else, creating a better solution, recognition by peers and superiors. Their loyalty is very high. Interestingly, if you were to profile, and I do a parallel profile of enterprise level CIOs, their motivations are very, very different. For one thing, their loyalty is quite low because there's a lot of turnover in their ranks. They are motivated more by the success of the organization than by their personal success. They want to work with people who are good team players, but are not necessarily all that innovative. The effectiveness of their organization is more important than their personal stature, because in fact their personal stature is best enhanced when the organization performs well. So if you're marketing, now here are two people who have the same basic job of IT manager, yet when you compare them head to head on these kinds of factors, you find that they have very different motivations. And I did this exercise with a client recently where we took the one category of product that they sold, and we said, let's identify four different kinds of buyers, four target buyers. And when they did this exercise with each of these buyers, they found that two of these buyers had completely diametrically opposite concerns. One of them was data scientists who tend to be risk takers. They're very experimentative. They're very creative. And the other extreme was risk managers who never take risks and don't see any upside to doing what is not what is not an established. They're very process oriented. Yet they were delivering the same message to both of these groups.
One of the things that jumped out on this page to me was the word quirky. And I was thinking that, a lot of people wouldn't think that you could market to an IT manager with somewhat of a quirky type of approach. I know that this means that they're quirky, but you may be able to relate that to some marketing you would do. And then conversely, if you're talking about a VP of finance or a controller, the last thing they are is quirky. So I thought there were certain words here that actually just jumped out at me and just gave me a picture of exactly what you're talking about.
Well, in fact, this is based upon, I know this audience very well because I'm involved with a group called, with a community called Spiceworks that is primarily made up of several million small business IT managers.
Right.
So I've had a great deal of experience interacting with these people, and quirky is a good word for them. There are a lot of, the fascinations with things like Star Wars and bacon, oddball kind of stuff that you wouldn't think, certainly it's not an enterprise CIO profile. Um, there are, yet they do fundamentally some of the same things enterprise CIOs do, but they're motivated very differently. And they're quirky people, and they will respond to quirky messages. In fact, they respond very well to quirky messages, which would not work with someone at a C level in a big company.
Right.
So final slide here, and then we'll get to questions. Here, think like a customer. And what this comes down to is, can you put yourself in the role of a customer? How do you get to meet customers? Well, it's difficult. It can be difficult, particularly when sales organizations tend to block access to their customers. But if you can go to the customer conference, if you can pick up the phone once a week and call a customer and just ask them about some of these questions about what motivates them, what keeps them up at night, what makes them feel successful, what's their proudest moment, what was their most embarrassing moment. Over time, a few of these interviews will begin to yield a lot of insight. Fundamentally, it comes down to, let's not talk about our solution. Let's talk about your problem. How are we going to help you with your problem? Let's not talk about reasons to buy us. Let's talk about options to consider that will make you successful. It's all about you. Uh, it's not why we're better. It's why customers choose us. Turn it around. What are the reasons customers say we're better? Certainly not what's in it for us. It's what's in it for you. It always has been about that. It's not about testimonials. It's about customers telling their own stories of why they're successful and how you enable them to be successful. And ultimately, not about innovation, which is the most overused buzzword in marketing. It's about alignment. It's about aligning solutions to the problems that your customers have and are trying to sell. If you go back to that early slide of the factors that B2B buyers said were important and that marketers were stressing, innovation was nowhere on that list. Buyers don't care about innovation. They care about making decisions that move the business forward. If it's innovative, great, but that's not the reason they make the call.
That corporate executive board report, again, going back to that, had kind of an interesting bunch of vignettes at the end of it, and one of them was about a manufacturer that they showed an ad from the 90s and an ad from today. And the ad from the 90s basically said, we've got 40 years of experience, we're big, we're great. And then the ad from, the most recently was more about a specific customer and what they worry about and exactly how this company really helped them. So I thought there was a vivid example of exactly what you're talking about here.
Great example. If we have any questions that have come in, we've got a few minutes left. I want to be sure to leave a little bit of time.
Well, Paul, one of the things I was going to ask about is you mentioned a couple of blogs. Before we get into some of the questions, maybe you can talk a little bit about your blogs and how the audience might see those or take a look at those blogs.
Well, I blog at paulgillin.com, and this is all linked to off of my website, gillin.com. I have another blog that's a little stranger. It's called Newspaper Death Watch, and I started it in 2007 when I was convinced that the newspaper industry was about to go off a cliff. And as someone who's very interested in the newspaper, in journalism and newspaper business, I wanted to document that, and so. I don't tend that blog as much as I used to, but there was a time when it was getting several thousand views a day, and you talk about the power of blogs back when the newspaper industry was really going through its crises in 2008, 2009. I was getting calls from media all around the world to be a spokesman, a quoted expert on the travails of the newspaper industry. And the whole reason was that if you typed death of newspapers into Google, I was the #1 result. And all these reporters were finding me that way. So it really is, blogs, I love blogs. They are sometimes controversial. Some people say they're dead. I don't think they're dead by any means. I think they're a great way to communicate expertise, to take advantage of search engine recognition, and to get your name out there, and particularly to get visibility with the media. I don't write for either blog that much anymore. Most of my writing now appears on other websites. So, like many writers, I kind of spread it around through a vast array of different outlets, and occasionally try to integrate them all in my blog. I do have a podcast for those of you in B2B who are interested. It's called FIR B2B, For Immediate Release B2B. It's part of the For Immediate Release network of podcasts. We've done about 20 shows, and it's all about B2B. Dan, you were an early guest on one of our podcasts,
Hello, thank you.
and we well, have great respect for you, and your book was your book is a must read as far as I'm concerned. The Truth About Leads. So that's we've done about 20 episodes of that podcast and continue to do a new one about every 2 weeks. So that's called FIR B2B.
We've got a few questions here. One, David, thank you. He says this is great material. He asks, is there a model or something to help evaluate our customer thought process?
Is there a standardized model? I do not know of any methodology for doing that. I think it's something that I've seen many companies do, modeling the decision process by actually talking with a group of customers. It's a great way to get sort of a focus group together. I'm not that big on focus groups, but if you could get a group of customers together in a room, and say you do this at a trade show, for example, or at a customer conference, and get 5 of your customers together in a room and really step through this decision-making process, I think that's enormously valuable because you discover the other factors that influence decisions. We tend to oversimplify the sales process and think, well, it's one guy, who makes the call. It's rarely one guy. There's usually a whole bunch of people. Dan, as you know from all your years, it's not uncommon to have 10 or 15 people involved in a buying decision. So I don't know of any standard model, but it's a heck of a good exercise to go through with your customers.
There's I'm not pitching here, but Ardith Alby's book has a section on persona development, which I think is probably one of the best I've ever seen. And that book is called Digital Relevance, and it came out yesterday. Just as an aside, Sean mentions that newspaperdeathwatch.com is unresponsive on Chrome. I wanted to make sure we were giving everybody the right URL, just in case others run into that problem.
Yeah, I checked it myself just last week. It was working fine, so I appreciate the heads up. There may be a problem with WordPress.
Okay. One question I have, and we've got a couple more that are coming in, is that I know when I look at our business, and candidly, the whole concept of personas, while it seems very simple, has been very difficult for me to get my arms around. That when you start to develop the personas, then you start to multiply the challenges of how you actually market your services and solutions to different people that are different buyers. For example, for us, we have salespeople who buy, marketing people who buy, sales operations people who buy, and even financial people who buy our services, not to mention the procurement side of the business. Is that a common, I guess you would call it an objection or a common concern? And, how might a company look at, it's not simplifying it, but how do you overcome that issue, do you think?
Well, I don't think there's a simple way to overcome it. It's a very common issue, and it's one of the reasons that we tend to oversimplify our perception of the customers, because we want to believe that there's just one person who who makes that call. There's one sort of generic persona, and as a salesperson and a financial person have very different motivations and styles. Um, I think that it comes down to trying to simplify the influencers of the decision. There may be 10 different influencers on a decision, but you can't serve 10 different masters. I think you have to identify the people who you are going to go after and develop those personas. So maybe there's 2 or 3 personas you develop, and you're going to have to forego the others because you simply don't have the resources to reach all of them. So I would say that you know, it, uh, take your best shot on who's really most likely to influence that decision. But it's a tough problem.
Yeah, and I think it's also, we have a relatively small business, and do you feel like there's a minimum size business that would benefit from this process, or do you? I think I know the answer to this. I think everybody might, but is there if you're a small business person or a medium-sized business person, how do you look at how you accomplish this, and how much budget can you appropriate towards this? How do you make some of those decisions?
I think this problem is much more pronounced in large corporations than in small businesses, and that is because there are so many layers between people within the organization and their customers. As I said, working with large organizations over the years, I find that it's very common that the people who are marketing to the customer have never actually may have worked at the company for 10 years and have never actually met a customer. Now, I don't know how you do that, but big organizations sort of they promote that distance. Small companies, the people who start the companies often are the customer, right? They come from the customer's background, so they instinctively understand the customer. B, they're much more likely to be in contact with the customer on a regular basis. So, I think big companies can take a cue from small businesses in how to turn those conversations into actionable insight and the importance of I mentioned Spiceworks earlier. This IT community I've worked with, they have a conference, an annual conference in Austin every year, and which is where their headquarters is. And during that 2-day conference, the company basically shuts down. They put a skeleton crew in there to keep the servers running, and everybody goes into this conference. The administrative assistants, the people in the mail room, the developers, everybody goes to this conference because it's a chance for everybody to interact with the customers. And if you can afford something like that, I encourage you to do it because your people will get so energized by talking with customers. It's an amazingly powerful experience to speak to customers. They will be so energized that they will come back transformed from that experience.
We had one more thought here. David asks, I mentioned the book a few times by Ardith Albee, and he asks that we send a link out to Amazon for that. We'll do you
I got
one
to get this
better.
book.
There will be, what's that?
I got to get this book. I have great respect for her. I want to see this.
Yeah. Well, if you go to PointClear.com and you visit our blog, within the next day or two, there will be actually a review of the book as well as a link to the book at Amazon.com. So just look for that. Go to PointClear.com, visit our blog, and you'll see the review of Ardith's book in just a day or two. Paul, we've reached the end of our time together. I just want to say thanks for joining us. We've gotten a lot of really positive comments about the value of the content, so thanks so much for taking time today.
Always a pleasure, Dan. I have great respect for you and what you do, and I'm glad we've been able to keep in touch.
Well, thank you. Same here. Before I sign off here, coming up on February 3rd is the next edition of PowerViews Live, and it's social media, why it doesn't work, with the 60-second marketer, Jamie Turner. I hope you'll tune in for that. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining us today. This is Dan McDade and Paul Gillin signing off from this edition of PowerViews Live. Thank you very much.